Hello, everybody. Welcome into the Apples and Genos Fantasy Hockey Podcast. My name is Nate Groot Niblink. I'm the creator of Apples and Genos, originator of the Zero G draft strategy. And in this podcast, I'm going to bring you a list of players that no one seems to be talking about for fantasy this season. Let's get it. Welcome into another solo episode for me here. I found myself through the off season here, through the lead up to all of our drafts, finding some players that didn't quite fit some of the other formats that we were talking about, but they all had some interesting aspects, and I just thought they were being kind of underappreciated and not being represented maybe as well as I wanted to in some other podcasts. And so that kind of gave me the idea for this podcast episode here, players that no one is talking about. I'm sure people in the comments can let me know. I'm sure there's other places that people are talking about some of these players, but it just seems like, at least on this podcast, on at Apples and Genos, we have maybe lessened our exposure to you on these players. So I wanted to bring that up a little bit more. I wanted to give these players their due and kind of highlight some interesting aspects about each of them and where you might be able to find some value in your drafts yet this year. Before we dig into that, I'm going to do another quick promo for Drafters Fantasy. They have the $11 entry NHL Best Ball Tournament, $50,000 in prizes, including $10K to the top place finish. Use promo code GINOS, GINOS, for a first-time deposit match up to $100. You can get in there and join me. Well over 100 drafts at this point. So, yes, I have definitely been into the streets for a fair bit here. And if you're feeling the draft itch as much as I am, you can get in there as well. All right, let's get into the meat of it. So the first category that I've got for some players here is defensemen that have two different types of value. Those two types of value I would categorize as both standalone, but also contingent value. And I'll clarify that a little bit. So standalone means these are guys that I think will sit on your roster all season long. You won't have to drop them at any point throughout the season. You may consider it at some point. They will inevitably have some stretches where you're like, man, I'm not really getting that much out of this player. But at the end of the season, you'll look back and you'll say, yeah, that was definitely, a guy that should have been on a roster all season long based on where he finishes at the end of the season. And so these defensemen, I think, are all fitting that mold, but they also have some unique contingent value where I think they could really explode and have a different level of fantasy production if another defenseman on their team were to go down to injury or get deprioritized by the coach for whatever reason. And so these are 6 defensemen that I think fit that category. The first one here, Thomas Harley. Obviously, we saw it last year, right? Thomas Harley had a big breakout last year, especially when Miro Heiskanen went down to injury, and Thomas Harley was one of the best defensemen in the league for fantasy while Heiskanen was out. I truly believe what I'm seeing with Harley. Everything under the hood looks really good from him. Still an ascending defenseman, like we may not have even seen his final form, as you might say. So I do really believe in the player. Dallas is going to be a wagon again this year, and I think that Harley is going to get in on that at even strength. You can think of Harley maybe as the Devon Taves to Cale Makar, the Devon Taves to Miro Heiskanen's Cale Makar, I should say. I think that that's a little bit of an apt comparison at this point, but I think that Thomas Harley actually does a little bit more for fantasy even than Devon Taves. Devon Taves, another player who could have made this list as well, but I think that Harley is a player that I want to be in on. Untapped ceiling, the potential that, yeah, if Heiskanen does go down, he's actually just like a league winner. Definitely within the realm of possibility for a guy like Thomas Harley. So he definitely deserves his spot on this list, as does the next one, Matthias Ekholm. Again, I think league winner potential. If anything happened to Evan Bouchard, then it would almost certainly be Ekholm on the top power play, and we've already seen what that Edmonton top power play can do for a defenseman's fantasy value. I think Ekholm would be an absolute smash at this point, but Ekholm is a guy who shoots, he hits, he blocks, he does all that peripheral stuff really well as is, and he also provides a baseline of even strength points that'll keep him in your lineup all season long. But being there in Edmonton, you always have that pop-off potential, especially with the new offensive additions that they've brought in this offseason. You have to, at least on paper, think that this could be a really exciting season offensively for Edmonton and therefore for Ekholm as well at even strength. Edmonton's defense core is not any better than it was last year, so Ekholm definitely going to be relied on for a ton of minutes once again this year. And then potentially, obviously not wishing anything bad on the other players that I'm going to mention here, but if anything were to happen to Evan Bouchard, then Ekholm would be an absolute smash play and a player that you'd love to wake up with on your roster that day. Next up, Vince Dunn. So we've actually had some interesting lines coming out of Seattle's training camp here. It looks like Vince Dunn has been playing on a power play that otherwise pretty much looks like a top power play unit. The McCann is on there, and Eberle's on there, Bjorkstrand's on there, Benier's on there. That kind of looks like a top power play unit. And then Brandon Montour's on the other unit with Chandler Stevenson, Shane Wright, Eli Tolvanen, Jaden Schwartz. It looks a little bit more like a second unit to me. Moreover, what I think this is telling us is that we're probably looking at a 1A, 1B situation once again in Seattle, which is not something to get excited about, but it was a possibility for Vince Dunn that he was just going to be on a seldom used second power play unit this year, and that's looking less likely now with the lines that we're getting out of training camp. And so that elevates his stock just on that basis alone, but if he were to get even more ice time, we've seen what Vince Dunn can do. He's been really effective. He's extremely efficient at even strength. He's had a really high IPP at even strength the last couple of years. He really does seem to be a play driving defenseman from the back end in his own right. And I don't think that's just going to go away this year. I think the Kraken could take a step as a team this year under Dan Bilesma, maybe score a few more goals. And Vince Dunn could just be a beneficiary of that at even strength. And then if he is still getting reasonable deployment, you have to remember last year, it's not like Vince Dunn he got the most power play deployment of all the defensemen, but it still wasn't to the level of a lot of other top power play quarterbacks around the league. And so you have to think that there might be some really hidden value here with Vince Dunn that a lot of other fantasy managers are going to be missing. And then again, you have that contingent value where, if anybody else goes down to injury in that top four, then Vince Dunn really is that guy, I think, that's going to eat a ton of minutes and could get up even above like a 25-minute a night scenario in some cases. Absolutely going to be a smash for fantasy at that point. And I think where he's going right now, he already is a smash for fantasy purposes. So really like Vince Dunn this year as well. Next up, Chris Letang. This one is pretty self-explanatory. I think, Erik Karlsson is going to run that top power play as he did for the vast majority of last year. Karlsson has been dealing with an injury, but it sounds like he's going to be good to go for the start of the season. Either way, Chris Letang still providing that standalone value at even strength, and did it last year. Once again, was a little bit over efficient probably on a few metrics and might not be quite as efficient this year. So it might not be quite as good as you saw last year from Chris Letang, but you have that standalone value, and then you have the contingent upside. If he gets back on the top power play, could we see 60-point Chris Letang again with all those crazy hits and blocks and shots that he does provide us already? That's definitely a possibility, and so that's another reason, another year to be in on Chris Letang at cost. Brady Shea going to Nashville, obviously behind Roman Josi, and so that's not really an exciting place for a lot of fantasy managers. We're hoping that he might get the chance to run his own power play. Doesn't look like that'll be the case this year, but Brady Shea never really got a top power play run in Carolina for any length of time anyway, and he is still valuable for fantasy. And I actually think that Nashville might be one of the most similar teams to Carolina in terms of their shot generation and the way they like to play. I think Shea is going to fit like a glove there. and he's going to pretty much do what he did in previous years. I think people are discounting Shea this year, and I don't think that that's necessarily accurate in this case. I think Shea is definitely a player that can provide standalone value on your team all year long, but very well might provide even more than that, and in the event of a Roman Josi injury would be an absolute smash in my opinion, because he can do a lot of similar things to Roman Josi. Obviously, no one can exactly replicate what Roman Josi brings to the hockey rink on a daily basis, but Brady Shea not going to be a bad substitute on that top power play and to get more minutes if Roman Josi were to go down to injury. So you have that contingent value with Brady Shea, and in that case, I think he could be an absolute smash for fantasy purposes. I love some Brady Shea pretty late in your drafts this year. Last up, Filip Hronek. It was a tale of two seasons for Hronek last year. Started the season with his tail on fire, then really fell off towards the back end of the year. I think the truth is somewhere in the middle, but that's still going to be good enough for fantasy purposes. I really do think that we're going to get a really solid season out of Filip Hronek this year. I'm not super worried about the end of season that was. I think more likely we should expect that he's just going to be one of these guys. I have him projected for 8 goals, 35 assists, 43 points, 150 shots. You know, he's going to provide around a hit per game, around a block per game. It's nothing too crazy, but he's going to provide decent enough production that he stays there at the bottom of your lineup all year long. You're the fourth defenseman on your team, maybe in a 4D roster setup. And he's just going to sit there, but you always have that potential that, again, if Quinn Hughes goes down to injury, Filip Hronek goes up on the top unit, and I have to believe that that would be an absolute smash spot for him. He would instantly go from like a 43-point pace projection up to like a 55, maybe 60-point pace projection, and that's where you're really reaping the benefits with Filip Hronek. So 6 defensemen here for you to take a look at. I just think these are guys where the upside cases are not really being baked in, and they're not really costing you anything to sit on your roster. So maybe 1 or 2 of these guys at the bottom of your roster this year is a good way to get yourself some exposure to just solid play in general, but then also the upside of the what if scenario, the absolute top end scenario where, yeah, there is an injury and they get up on a top power play, and all of a sudden they're one of those guys that you just had to have to win your league this year. All right, the next category here, forgotten stud forwards. So these are all guys that have had terrific seasons in the past and for whatever reason are being faded a little bit in our drafts this year. It feels like they're just not really being talked about. Nobody's really excited to draft these players this year. And so for that reason, I think there's probably some value here. Alex DeBrincat, the first one here on Yahoo, going at 87, ESPN 80, Fantrax 77. So he's being faded, definitely a far cry from where he has been going in previous years, and with some reason, right? Like last year, he started off with his tail on fire, and then towards the end of the year, ended off with his tail between his legs, and it was just truly awful. Still don't know really what the whole story was there, but we've seen the potential. We've seen the proof of production with Alex DeBrincat in the past. Maybe another year in Detroit and it all starts to come together a little bit more. Early returns have him skating on a line with Dylan Larkin. That's where you want a guy to be if you're going to get some fantasy production out of your forward. And I have to think that there's another gear here for Alex DeBrincat in year 2 in Detroit. They're into this player for a long time. It's not going away anytime soon. I think they got to figure it out a little bit, and I think they will. So I really do think that Alex DeBrincat is a probable value, and probably just a player that people are going to sleep on a little bit. They'll be like, oh yeah, I can draft Alex DeBrincat here, but no one's really reaching for him, and so you'll probably find him at some value in your drafts this year, and thereby get some potential value from a player that nobody's really talking about this year. Next up, Jared McCann. We've been talking about Jared McCann. I've been trying to bring him up more, but I still don't think I've done it enough, so I am going to add him in here. I absolutely love this player for fantasy this year. I don't think his upside scenarios are being properly weighted at all. Going 152 on Yahoo, 123 on ESPN, 104 on Fantrax. Jared McCann should definitely be going in double-digit ADPs across every format. And I think that this is one of the more mispriced players across every format this year. I think Jared McCann is set up to absolutely smash this year. He was very solid last year, skating just like his typical 16 minutes a night. If he gets up into the 18-minute range and everything we're seeing from these lines, from the power play units, he's being put into the position with the top players, playing with Matty Beniers, who's obviously the kind of 1C that they're looking at there in Seattle. I think that this is got to be the year that Jared McCann really pops off. He's already had one of those years, and it feels like last year it kind of regressed, and everybody just forgot about Jared McCann. I do think he can do it again. I do think he's got 40-goal potential again this year. Pavel Buchnevich, number 3 here. Buchnevich had a pretty tough year last year, for sure, and he's being discounted as such. 153 on Yahoo, 172 on ESPN, 105 on Fantrax. A little bit more respect on his name there, but either way, I do like Buchnevich a whole lot this year. Just a guy who's probably going to very quietly score 70 points. They have nobody else in St. Louis to take away his minutes. He's going to get all the top power play time. He's going to skate probably close to 20 minutes a night there. And he's just going to compile stats at the end of the day. And I love these players that you can get a little bit later on in your drafts. Nobody's really thinking about them. Everybody's chomping at the bit to grab the next big sleeper, the JJ Peterkas of the world. I am too, but I'm not going to forget about guys that will really fill out my roster and that I can feel really solid in. Last year, a guy like that was Brock Nelson for me. This year, I think a guy like Pavel Buchnevich could be that forgotten veteran on a team that nobody really wants to think about for fantasy. And he's just going to provide that 70 points on the year. And you're going to look back and say, man, that really did add a baseline of production to my lineup that really pushed me over the top in a few matchups this year. Lastly here, Mark Stone, if you've already heard the ADP values podcast that Blake and I did together, then you've heard me talk a little bit about Mark Stone. I think everybody's just sick of Mark Stone missing a whole bunch of time, which is valid. I don't deny that, but where he's going so late in these drafts, 156 on Yahoo, 201 on ESPN, 139 on Fantrax. I just think that that's value. I think you can get him at that spot and just bake in the 70-point production that he's going to have as long as he is in your lineup. Sure, he might have some ongoing problems that may rear up throughout the year. Maybe he does miss the end of the year again and you're kind of pissed off that he's not providing you anything in your fantasy playoffs. But I still think that Mark Stone is that kind of guy who can provide something to get you to the playoffs, and it's on you then to work the waiver wire to find the next group of players, either by trade or the waiver wire, that can really elevate your team come playoff time and put you over the top. I think Mark Stone is one of those guys who can absolutely get you there, though. All right, I've got a few more, but before we get there, want to remind everybody about the Apples and Genos Patreon. We're heading very close to the season, getting ready for all of our waiver wire content, all of our player analysis content as we start to get some games played. So make sure you get into the Apples and Genos Patreon. $2 a month gets you access to the monthly patron-only live shows. $8 a month gets you access to those live shows, but also access to patron-only Discord channels. You're also going to get access to my show notes, including my waiver wire ads, my targets, and all the players I'd be dropping, bad schedules, schedule analysis is in there. We talk about players, and I list them there in the show notes about players that I'm looking to add for the season long that I still think you can probably hang on to beyond just a single week, like a streamer scenario. And then also we've got player evaluation tools that are going to be available to Patreon members at this tier level. So make sure that you get into there. And if you're a true degenerate, you can get into the Genos tier. $15 a month gets you all those perks, but also gets you every single question answered, guaranteed by myself. All right, let's get back over to the players. These ones I would call overshadowed forwards. So these are players that just have probably some sexier names either on their line or on their team. And I think that we should not forget about these players and what they might be able to do for us for fantasy this year. Top one, Pavel Zacha. This is a guy, I think he's stapled to Pastrnak, even strength on the power play. Both of these guys are Czech guys, for whatever that's worth. If you want to believe the countryman narrative, then that's there for you as well. But Zacha just feels like a guy who, again, maybe a bit of a deeper cut. I think all three of these guys are a bit deeper cuts than the ones that I provided before. But I do think that Zacha will provide, somewhere around 60 points when it's all told at the end of the season. And that's going to be valuable for you, especially if you can get him right at the end of your drafts and just set and forget in your lineup and work the waiver wire for everything else that you need. That is going to be some value for you. I don't think he has a ton of upside to, have a pop off year and score 80 points. I don't really think that's in the cards for Zaka. I don't think he's quite that talented, but I think he's going to be put in a lot of advantageous situations to score points this year, and he's going to provide decent production. And so I think this is a player that's just being absolutely left for dead while everybody looks for the next big thing, the next big breakout. And some places, especially if you've already earlier in the draft taken a couple of shots on players that you think might break out, you've taken your Wyatt Johnsons, your JJ Peterkas a little bit earlier in the draft, and now you're like, man, I don't think I should just take only like huge upside shots. I think I need a guy here who I can just pencil into my lineup every day. Pavel Zacha can absolutely be that guy for you. Next one here, Yegor Sharangovich. We've got some early lines coming out of Calgary, and it looks favorable for Sharangovich once again. I think he's going to be a lock on the power play because he was so effective there last year. But at even strength, it looks like he's lining up alongside Kadri and Kuzmenko in the early going here. That's a great scenario. I was a little bit worried about how this might unfold because you could find yourself, as Jonathan Huberdeau is right now, playing with Pospisil and Mantha. I don't really like that scenario. Much prefer where Sharangovich is finding himself right now. And so that's given me a little bit more confidence to make the click on Sharangovich. I think this is a player I was pleasantly surprised when doing his projection. Found it hard to really discount what he's been able to bring to the Flames with some additional ice time. Really does seem like this is a player that we should bank on for 25 goals, 25 assists with upside for more beyond that, especially if he starts to get leaned on as part of a top line alongside Kadri. I think that there's definitely an upside scenario for 30, maybe even 35 goals for Sharangovich if he absolutely hits his ceiling and continues to kind of improve his talent in a second full year in Calgary. I think that that's a reasonable projection for Sharangovich to think that he could even outdo what he did last year given the right situation. So I'm interested in Sharangovich. Obviously, it's a late pick, and if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. You're not going to be too sad about it. But I think that there are definitely worse bets that you can make. I think he's overshadowed by everybody wondering what to do with Huberdeau, by Kadri just being the best player, the best forward on the team anyway, by what to do with Mackenzie Weegar. Is he not going to be on power play? One, is he? I think all that is playing into the scenarios here, but I think Sharangovich might quietly be the one that you wanted to roster all along. And lastly here for the overshadowed forwards, I have Kirill Marchenko. Marchenko is a player that I've liked for a long time. Underlying stats have looked terrific. This is a guy, as Blake will tell you, he's great off the rush. There's lots of YouTube highlight videos out there that you can find of Kirill Marchenko absolutely galloping in and making wild moves on defensemen, making them look silly going to the net. He does seem to have that nose for the net. He has got a great shot. He likes to use it. Did seem like last year he was one of the players more affected by the insanity that was Pascal Vincent as an NHL head coach. This year under Dean Evison, he could not end up not being a favorite of Dean Evison. I'm not discounting that that's a possibility, but I am also thinking to myself, what if here with Kirill Marchenko? They need scoring. Kirill Marchenko, one of the more dynamic players on this roster, in my opinion. And so could he be prioritized even more this year? Could he get more even strength deployment, more power play deployment, more of a solidified role than he's ever had with this team? And could he pop off and have that 30-plus goal season? I definitely think that's a possibility for a player of his talents. And so I don't want to be, again, kind of sitting here talking about Adam Fantilli. I love Adam Fantilli. I think he's going to be a star in the league, but I don't want to discount Kirill Marchenko and what he might be able to bring as well, because I do think that while he's being overshadowed by the Fantilli talk, even on this podcast, I want to make sure that I shout out Kirill Marchenko, one of those guys you can add at the end of your drafts, maybe even pick up on waivers after your draft is done, and you can just see what happens, right? You can see what happens in the early going. If he is getting that treatment from Dean Evison, I'm sure there'll be some ups and downs with this team to start the season, but I do think that Evison is going to have a calming influence on the roster overall, and I think that Marchenko should be one of these players to benefit. Last one here, last round stashes. These are just some players that I think you can probably get in the last round of your drafts in a lot of cases, and it's definitely going to be worth it in my opinion. First one here, Barrett Hayton. Barrett Hayton has been playing up on some pretty interesting lines, playing alongside Genther on the power play and Sergachev and Keller. So it seems like he is going to be C1 on the power play to start the year, not Logan Cooley. And so that's obviously of interest. And then also getting some good spots alongside Keller and alongside Nick Schmaltz on the top line, where he had so much success 2 years ago. I think Barrett Hayton has kind of been left for dead. Everybody thinks that the end of that season in 22-23 was just kind of a flash in the pan. I'm not so sure. It might have been. It might be that Barrett Hayton is just more of a 45-point guy, a middle six center for the rest of his NHL career. But that flash was so big and so good that I'm willing to take that swing, especially in the last round where it literally costs you almost nothing. I think that Barrett Hayton could have a really nice start to the year. I think Logan Cooley is the 1C of the future in Utah, but I don't know that that necessarily happens this year. And so Barrett Hayton as a last round pick, I am definitely interested in, given the early deployment that we've been seeing out of Utah. Jack Quinn is my number 2, and I'll throw in Thomas Tatar as my number 3. These are two guys that I think kind of go hand in hand here, just because I think that you want to be, with your last round picks, you want to be taking a look at the early schedules here. And another nice note for Jack Quinn is that he did get a look on the top power play. Peterka, Thompson, Tuck, and Jack Quinn were the 4 forwards there. Dylan Cousins was on the second unit. If that comes true, then obviously Jack Quinn has a lot more interest for you. But either way, I think he's locked in on the second line alongside Cousins, probably Zach Benson, who could take a step this year as well. I think that's a good spot. And New Jersey and Buffalo play these 2 games overseas to start the year, October 4th and 5th next week. And so I think that you could be into these guys and just get those 2 games from them and then drop them. And you're kind of getting a head start on your opponents for free, if you will, with those late round picks. Thomas Tatar has been getting a look up the lineup over there in New Jersey. And so that's a little bit interesting for me, playing alongside Nico Hischier and Dawson Mercer in the last game against Washington that we saw. I'm interested to see if that continues. Obviously, keep checking lineups wherever you can get them on Twitter or wherever and see if that comes true. But I think Thomas Tatar could have, maybe he's that guy that he scores 2 goals in the first game of the season and everybody's watching it because it's the only games going on. Everybody rushes to the waiver wire to grab him. But you're smarter than that. You've picked him up just for those 2 games. You drop him after that and you go on with your streaming. I think that could be a scenario that comes true for a guy like Thomas Tatar. So I wanted to shout him out here. And then lastly here, Gabriel Landeskog and Valerie Nichushkin. I think both these players provide really interesting points for this team in Colorado. Doesn't really look like either player, like Landeskog rather, is going to be able to start the season. Nichushkin is still serving a suspension, won't be eligible to return until November, but we have gotten some word now that it does look like the plan is to bring him back immediately in November, and so he should be back. Both players should be back at some point in the relatively near future, and so I think both have pretty big potential, right? There are 2 spots up for grabs on this top power play. Jonathan Drouin, Casey Middlestat on there right now. I think in a scenario where both are up to speed, I think Landeskog and Nichushkin displace both of those players and should get on a top power play unit. I think both players are very interesting for fantasy purposes this year. Landeskog, obviously, we won't really know. He's been away from hockey for a long time. We don't really know what the effects of his knee injury will be on his abilities as a player moving forward. But I'm willing to find out with the last round stash, put him on IR, see when he comes back, what the deployment is. He's still the captain of this team. I think that they're going to give him a fair shot and try to make it work with him, even if he's not as good as he once was. Like, this was a point per game bangers elite player once upon a time. Even if he's 60% of that, I think you're getting a bit of a steal late with Gabriel Landeskog. So pick him up, throw him on the IR. Same goes for Nichushkin. If you can put him on your IR, do check your settings and see if he's IR eligible. You don't want him just taking up a bench spot for, the first 6 weeks of the season or something like that. That's not going to fly. But if you can put him in an IR or like an NA spot, depending on your format setup, then definitely I think Nichushkin makes some sense as a last round pick. All right. That is going to be it for this one. Make sure you check out the Apples and Gionos Fantasy Guide. Join the Discord community. Like, rate, review, subscribe, comment. All those things really help us out over here. But that is going to be all that I've got for this episode. Hopefully it brought you some value, helped you get a little bit better at fantasy hockey today. Many thanks to the band there for supplying music for the podcast. Be sure to check out their Spotify as well. That's it, folks. Much love.